Well, thank you very much, Christoph, for that ever so slightly exaggerated but wonderfully generous introduction. Also, thank you to Helmut as well, and to the selectors for the Rachel Carson Center. It is a huge pleasure to be here and to have the wonderful privilege of spending a few months working here. I really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone for coming. Not quite sure why you're all here, but anyway. So what I'm going to do is talk today about what I've been doing over the past month. It's part of a wider project comparing climate skepticism in Germany with that in the USA and Britain. And I'd be happy to say more about that later if you're interested. At this point, I'll just say that the project aims to complement work on climate skepticism in environmental sociology, politics, and communication or media studies by looking at structured, authored skeptical texts, including journalistic articles, blogs, and popular science books, alongside novels, films depicting or advocating skeptical positions. The project asks what kinds of selves and others skeptical texts construct, what concepts of nature, science, and environmental risk they defend. The need to mitigate and adapt to global warming is among the greatest challenges in the 21st century. And this challenge is as much social and political as it is scientific and technical. The German government has ambitious plans to switch from fossil fuels to renewables, and climate skepticism delegitimizes this policy by casting doubt on whether either the existence of global warming, or of the man-made origin of climate change, or of the efficacy of policies to mitigate climate change. So my project seeks to find out more about the different variants of climate skepticism in Germany, self-understanding of skeptics, what they share with skeptics in America and Britain, what special factors there are in Germany. And here's an overview of what I may not have time to cover all the things at the end, but definitions and differentiations at first, historical overview of the United States, a little bit about types and strategies of argument from climate skeptics, then to look at climate skepticism in Germany, institutions, actors, question of how much political influence they have, and then to move on to the focus of my particular project, which is not so much concerned with the political aspects as with the cultural constructions, the discursive construction of climate change in the eyes of skeptics, so threats to identity and so on. And then I'll look at some examples in the media and the internet, popular science and popular culture. That's where I may skip a little bit. Tentative conclusions at the end. So, all natural scientists are skeptics. They insist that any claim is supported by evidence and scrutinize the quantity and quality of the evidence. So people who refuse to accept scientific evidence for anthropogenic climate change aren't really skeptics, although some of them like to call themselves so. The ethnographer Kari Nogor therefore uses the term denial in her study of climate-related attitudes and behaviour in a small town in Norway living in denial, published 2011. She argues that so-called climate skeptics are actually deniers. They practice willful ignorance. However, the term denier seems best avoided, especially in the German context, because it suggests an analogy with Holocaust denial and implies that climate skepticism is a deliberate misrepresentation, distortion of facts for ideological reasons, which is immoral and should be punished by law. Others use the term contrarian, for instance, the veteran American climate scientist James Hansen. Contrarians take up positions contrary to received wisdom, either as a gambit to incite discussion or simply because they take pleasure in disagreeing with the majority. I have a brother-in-law who's a bit like that. Contrarians are found where scientific evidence bears on political, social or cultural controversies. For instance, in disputes over creationism versus evolution in the United States, over reasons for the spread of AIDS, and the alleged danger of autism from vaccination. Contrarianism is, however, only, to my mind, a subset of climate skepticism, and so I'm sticking with the term climate skepticism, although it's not an ideal one. So a different way of looking at different kinds of... Have I gone? Yes. The second lot here of distinctions is between literal, interpretive, and implicatory denial. These are terms used by Kari Norgor. Literal denial is, of course, that there is no global warming. Interpretive is a minimization of its negative consequences, and implicatory is an acceptance of the fact, but at the same time continuing to act as if it had no moral or political implications for us. And this last form of skepticism is the most widespread. And finally, one can distinguish between trend skeptics who deny there is a global warming trend. For instance, the American physicist Fred Singer. Singer, author of a much cited article in the Washington Times in 1996. This is my next, yes. Disinformation about global warming, a much cited article, later shifted the basis of his contrarian position, publishing a book titled Unstoppable Global Warming Every 1500 Years. So natural causes, he is saying, are responsible. So there's trend skeptics like Singer, there's attribution skeptics who attribute it to natural causes, that's his second position. And most climate skeptics today are in that category, really. There are impact skeptics who claim its impact will on the whole be benign or even beneficial, and on the right here, if you can see it, is a picture cover of a book by Gerd Ganterfeuer, a professor of physics at the University of Constance, showing polar bears happily paddling in front of a tropical island. And then there are climate policy skeptics who don't dispute climate change or its consequences, but argue the urgency of protecting the climate has been exaggerated, and attempts to do so are either doomed to failure or disproportionately costly when compared to other urgent social needs, such as Björn Lomborg, author of The Skeptical Environmentalist and Cool It. So, historical overview. Hayden Washington and John Cook give a very readable account in their book Climate Change Denial Heads in the Sand. The first significant environmental skepticism movement in the US may have been the reaction to Rachel Carson, in fact, in 1962, Silent Spring. The first scientific evidence, as opposed to theories about climate change, were presented in a report by the US National Academy of Scientists in 1979. It was immediately challenged. I'm skipping rather quickly through things, but in 1984, two influential Reaganite think tanks were founded. Just looking at the home pages of these, the George C. Marshall Institute and the Heartland Institute. The Heartland Institute is the primary American organization promoting climate change skepticism today. The links between climate skepticism, conservative political groupings, and industrial lobbies have received considerable attention. Peter Jacques Riley Dunlap and Mark Freeman found in an article on the Organization of Denial in 2008 that of 141 skeptical books published between 1972 and 2005, the authors of no fewer than 130 had links with conservative think tanks. Most frequently cited study of climate skepticism in America is Naomi Oresk's and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt. Did I have a picture of that? Yes, Merchants of Doubt. Oresks and Conway demonstrated that climate change skepticism is the latest in a long line of anti-science campaigns. The same groups, and in some cases the same individuals, challenged the evidence for forest dieback being caused by acid rain, for aerosols causing the hole in the ozone layer, for second-hand smoke increasing the risk of cancer, and for burning fossil fuels being responsible for global warming. So it took until about 1988, a hot summer. I'm afraid public responses to climate change do tend to depend on hot summers or cold winters or extreme weather. Anyway, in the summer of 1988, climate change first became a matter of public concern in the US, and organized skepticism, which had hitherto been limited to scientific circles, appeared in political debates and the media. Washington and Cook distinguished between three main phases of climate skepticism. First half of the 1990s, challenging the science and stressing that there were disagreements and uncertainties. Second phase, after about 1997, the Kyoto Conference, delegitimation of climate politics, the focus on economic and social consequences. So a shift there from denying the phenomenon to contesting the way it was responded to politically. And a final phase where industry sort of takes the bit and tries to present itself as being the true actor in dealing with climate change. So industry and technology is able to solve the problem, and of course through the back door, coal and nuclear are essential bridges because we can't yet produce enough energy by renewables. So how widespread is climate skepticism in the American public? How seriously does it deserve to be taken? What role have industrial lobby groups and neoliberal think tanks played in sowing the seeds of doubt and influencing politics? One study by Anthony Lazarevitz, a national study of what the American public understood about the causes, impacts and solutions to global warming, 2010. 63% said they believed in global warming, which is comforting. 19 said they didn't, and another 19 said they didn't know. Well, so far so good, but a third of the respondents were, as he had classified in a previous study, disengaged, doubtful or dismissive about measures to mitigate climate change, and over half were cautious. So these deeply divided public views stand in absolute contrast to the consensus, almost 100% consensus among scientists on the reality of climate change and the necessity for action. And a report by Greenpeace America, Greenpeace USA, entitled Dealing in Doubt, the Climate Change Denial Machine versus Climate Science, concludes the individuals, organizations and corporate interests who comprise the climate denial machine have caused harm and have slowed our response time. As a result, we will all ultimately pay a much higher cost as we deal with the impacts, both economic and ecological. So, quite critical there. Of course, that is Greenpeace. Types of argument and strategies. Over the last 3 decades, the arguments of climate skeptics have fallen into 4 broad categories, which you have here. First of all, the science is too uncertain to serve as the justification for expensive measures to prevent global warming. This is the most common single argument. Skeptics have taken issue with the choice of proxies for warming, whether you're taking tree trunks or you're taking ice cores or whatever it is, and they've taken issue with the modeling simulations of climate change. However, their main complaint is with the IPCC, with the way it works, with its probability calculations. They interpret these as signs of uncertainty and disagreement. The second argument is that there has always been climate instability, and natural fluctuations in solar irradiation are chiefly responsible for global warming. The Earth's distance from the Sun varies on its slightly elliptical orbit, the so-called Milankovitch cycle, and there are natural phases of heightened solar activity, more solar flares and so on at some times. An associated argument is that most CO2 emissions are attributable to natural causes, volcanoes being among the factors, and that only a tiny proportion of global warming is really anthropogenic. This is actually not true. I just say that because when you're reading all this skeptical stuff, you begin to become unsure. The third argument is the negative consequences of global warming have been grossly exaggerated. Skeptics stress the positive effects of warming, either for the planet as a whole, the oceans will have a greater uptake of CO2 because of the warming water, or for certain regions. For instance, there will be fewer winter deaths in the north, a longer growing season, agriculture will be possible again in Greenland, we will have access to mineral extraction in the Arctic, and free trade route in the Northwest Passage, and so on and so on. So we're forgetting all the people dying of drought in Africa. It follows that climate protection measures are a waste of money and there are more important things to do. And finally, who is profiting? Climate scientists are accused of just looking for funds for their research, and the politicians looking for attention and influence. The IPCC has been accused of deliberately manipulating results to exaggerate the dangers from climate change. Scientists are described as priests of an ecological religion, policing the discourse by excluding dissenters. There have been many personal attacks in America, particularly on Michael Mann, who is the lead author in a paper on the so-called hockey stick graph. And in Germany, Stefan Rahmstorff, for instance, has been called the Savonarola of the German climate scene. His actions have been compared to the activities of Deutsche Physiker in the Third Reich. Hermann Ott, climate spokesperson of the Greens in the Bundestag, has been accused of orchestrating a witch hunt on skeptics akin to the Nazis' treatment of the Jews. So this comes out again and again, this sort of slur of fascism. In terms of strategies, skeptics tend to work with a mixture of incorrect claims and misleading half-truths. They misinterpret quotations, they remove qualifiers, they use the technique of bait and switch. They're just using a true proposition and then using it to imply a similarly sounding false one. They rarely present data of their own. They cherry-pick the arguments and findings of a tiny minority of scientists, and they ignore majority in research. So the findings of mainstream researchers are dismissed as junk science, or in the words of Sarah Palin, snake oil science. An ideological polarization has then taken place in America. In the early 90s, views on global warming depended primarily on how much attention the respondent had paid to climate science. But 2 decades later, you could make a guess at an American's position on global warming by identifying their views on abortion, same-sex marriage, or gun control. Apologies to Hal and other Americans present. Global warming has been turned into a battleground then in a wider cultural war. This has not happened to the same extent in Britain and in Germany, with different political and cultural constellations, but activist and skeptical responses to the challenge of climate change also play a significant role in debates here on how society works and how it should work. So if I move on to climate skepticism in Germany, because of Germany's consensual political culture and tradition of corporatist cooperation between politics and industry, there's been cross-party agreement on climate change and a buy-in of industry since the beginnings of political concern in 1987-88. Skepticism was relatively rare until the ClimateGate affair of 2009 and the collapse of the Copenhagen Conference, which damaged public confidence in climate science. Since 2009, the rise of a new form of skepticism we find focused on opposition to climate protection policies, Klimaschutz. And this has gathered momentum in the last 5 years. Two accounts of climate skepticism in Germany have recently been published. The first is Achim Brunnengräber's working paper, a 50-page paper, very, very solid work, Klimaskeptiker in Deutschland und ihr Kampf gegen die Energiewende. He works at the FU in Berlin. The second is Tanja Fröhlich's book, Klimaskepsis in Deutschland, Handlungsempfehlungen für Politik und Wissenschaft, just come out last year. Both understand skepticism not in the narrow sense of denying anthropogenic global warming, but as a position challenging the necessity for climate protection measures, especially the very ambitious goals set out in the WGBU, the Scientific Advisory Committee's report Welt im Wandel, Gesellschaftsvertrag für eine große Transformation. So this is a very ambitious program of social transformation, a new social contract. Like most research into American skepticism, though, both these studies aim less to understand skeptics and to address their fears and aspirations than to suggest strategies for limiting their political influence. But they do provide a lot of useful information. So if I've used them then to look at, for instance, this is the key organization in Germany, the European Institute for Climate and Energy, EICE, too small for you to read, I'm afraid, but founded in Jena in 2007, the only significant German organization denying the existence of anthropogenic climate change. EICE rejects climate policies of any kind as a pretext for disempowering industry and the citizen and imposing levies. EICE has links with the Heartland Institute and the Global Warming Policy Foundation in the States and similar organizations in the UK. It organizes climate and energy conferences and it campaigns against energy system change. That's Energiewende. The EICE Handbook for Climate Skeptics says, there is a huge heap of proofs that the world is getting warmer. So they're not denying that at this point anyway. But CO2 is not responsible for it. The arguments that CO2 is responsible for it is as thin as a fly's leg, and it is crumbling if we only push hard enough. It's a bit of a mixed metaphor there. And they end by saying, it's not the climate which is threatened, but it's our freedom. So environmental protection, yes. Climate protection, no. Political parties. Climate skepticism is not the official policy of any German political party. The few actively skeptical politicians are at home in the FDP and the CDU, so liberals and conservatives. FDP in Saxony has been particularly pro-skeptical. Holger Kramer, member of the European Parliament for the FDP from 2004, has disputed the reality of global warming, opposing regulation, predicting the loss of jobs, stressing scientific uncertainty. He's described forecasts of temperature rise as Kaffeesatzleserei, so sort of reading the tea leaves. Putting it in English anyway, British English. In 2010 he published a book, Unbequeme Wahrheiten über die Klimapolitik and so on, a new liberal approach, and in 2011 another book. 2012 he organized a so-called alternative climate conference in Dresden to combat what he called media hysteria and green actionism. And in 2014 he lost his seat in the European Parliament. So the political influence of skeptics in Germany, you might conclude, is not that great. Beyond this limited presence of climate skepticism in German politics, though, Fröhlich writes of a wider tendency towards hidden skepticism, which has found expression in calls for moderation in expenditure and for understanding of skeptical positions. Brunnengräber also argues that skeptical positions have gained respectability in Germany over the last 5 years and are finding prominent supporters. He explains this as a result of disillusionment with the impasse in international climate politics since the Copenhagen Conference and a loss of faith in climate science, by concerns over energy security, so Germany's need to have enough energy, the role played by fossil fuel production and consumption in the German economy, and anchoring German society, the anchoring of German society in a resource-intensive way of life, and an underlying belief we can control nature. So, opposition to regulation finds expression in polemic attacks on eco-socialism. The planned economy and eco-dictatorship are terms used. International climate policy is no longer the main target of these attacks, but national policies, and in particular the Renewable Energy Act, EEG. Climate debates have increased in number and intensity in recent years, and both the government and scientific institutions have come under pressure to defend themselves. Brunnengräber finishes his report saying that a market for skeptical positions has emerged, offering skeptics attention, money, and prestige. And skeptics now have institutions, access to decision makers and the media, international contacts, and a growing web presence. However, maybe he's egging it on a bit. Fröhlich sees less cause for concern. Nomen ist Omen Fröhlich, of course she's optimistic. At no time has skepticism in Germany been as strong as in the USA, she writes. Its influence on policy is small, and Eike has negligible influence in the media, politics or public opinion. And her own analysis of some articles, hundreds of articles she looked at in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, Spiegel, Die Welt and Handelsblatt from 2010 to 2011 revealed that rather little space was actually given over to skepticism in articles on the climate. The percentage was highest in Die Welt at just over 5%, which is not a huge percentage. So, how does Germany rank in international comparison? Germany doesn't have the extensive network of skeptics funded by lobbyists, foundations and think tanks close to the oil, gas and coal industry, which are found in the United States. A figure I read somewhere for the amount of money spent by the American oil and gas industry on sowing the seeds of doubt was $420 million. Some people have obviously become quite rich. In Germany, there are very few organizations which spend money on advertising campaigns to play down the dangers of climate change. The Braunkohleverband is one of them, but it's one of very few. And very few German skeptics appear to have direct links with industry. There are also yes, maybe the logic here, the connection not so good, but this is an account of deeper cultural reasons for the low level of skepticism in Germany. It's been broad public agreement on the reality and seriousness of climate change, whereas in America you've got this polarization between Democrats and Republicans. A study in 2009 showed that 75% of Democrats believed in anthropogenic climate change, but only 19% of Republicans. In Germany, the press is less polemical, debates less ideologically charged, religious fundamentalism doesn't seem to play any role. Finally, there's a widely shared sense of the intrinsic value of nature and of intergenerational responsibilities. So as Tanja Fröhlich puts it, in Deutschland herrscht eine Umweltkultur. So most people are favorably disposed. German attitudes towards climate change are nevertheless, I would argue, conflicted. Kari Norgård observed in her study of skepticism in Norway that the Norwegians tend to deny the implications of climate change because of their self-image as a people close to nature. This stood in conflict with there being a major greenhouse gas emitter through their exploitation of North Sea oil fields. Seems to me there's a parallel here in Germany, which has obviously also a long tradition of a self-image close to nature. Since the 1980s, indeed, environmentalism has become a key feature of German national identity. The country is nevertheless a major producer of carbon dioxide, generating a large proportion of energy from burning low-grade coal, lignite or Braunkohle. So Germany's impressive reduction of pollution levels since the 70s has been achieved in part by exporting polluting production to the Far East. And of course, Germans are very good at concealing the environmental impact of fast cars with large engines by stressing how efficient and clean the engines are. These arguments, I hasten to say, are not my own really. They come from Frank Uekerter in his book Germany - The Greenest Nation ? Most existing research on climate skepticism has been concerned with outing skeptics as individuals or groups with vested interests in fossil fuels. However, non-material sociocultural factors play an important role as drivers of everyday implicatory climate skepticism. So, threats to identity, amplification through media communication, discursive construction, and climate skepticism. How am I doing for time, Christoph?
Well, we've got 3, 4, 5 minutes.
Okay. I think I might just skip this bit and move on to look at the examples. This is not so exciting, really. I couldn't resist showing how the Spiegel has sort of alternated between alarmism and, if you can see the subtitle of the later edition there, it's Vom Umweltschutz zum Öko-Wahn, so environmental madness. This is an example of an environmental blog, which is what I'm going to pick up again. The web has become the main platform for skepticism in Germany as elsewhere. Klimaskeptiker.info's homepage begins, "Is the world doomed? The greenhouse effect is increasing, it's getting warmer, the poles and the glaciers are melting, the sea level is rising, the Gulf Stream will soon stop circulating, droughts and floods are on the increase, climate catastrophe is here, and you are to blame because you produce CO2. Do you believe all of this? Then you're wrong. This page is an attempt to enlighten you about one of the commonest mistakes today, the fairy tale of climate catastrophe and its alleged cause, greenhouse gases produced by human beings. So that's the one of the websites. A letter received by the Bavarian Linke politician Eva Bulling-Schröter in 2009 nicely illustrates the climate skeptics' understanding of self and other. The writer declares themselves the victim of a swindle comparable to the sale of indulgences which Luther broke with the Catholic Church over in 1517. So, environmentalists and the IPCC are seen as the Catholic Church selling indulgences. Like the Church at the time, according to the letter writer, climate scientists are playing on the public's fear, guilt, and longing for redemption. The citizen is being fleeced, taken for a ride. The letter suggests German skepticism is in part a response to the emotional appeals of environmentalists and their moral opprobrium for environmentally damaging consumption. So I'm now going to move on to Die kalte Sonne, the cold sun, why the climate catastrophe is not happening, by Fritz Fahrenholt and Sebastian Lüning. This popular science book has 350 pages of text and another 70 pages of references. It's full of graphs. It is not a book for casual readers. It stands at the more serious end of the Sachbuch, or popular science, non-fiction, explaining science for a public general readership. The authors accept the existence of global warming, but argue that most of it derives from fluctuations in solar irradiation. They do not dispute the greenhouse properties of CO2, but they say its importance has been greatly exaggerated. They argue that since 1988 we've entered a period of cooling which will last for several decades. This will give us time to put the economy on a sustainable basis without risky restructuring measures such as carbon trading. Fahrenholt and Lüning marshal a good deal of science in support of their arguments. For the non-expert, they make a very plausible case. This explains why Stefan Rahmstorff and others have taken such pains to discredit the book, because pretty well everything is slightly wrong in it. Fahrenholt describes the IPCC as dangerously mixing politics with science. He implies they have deliberately overstated the impact of climate change. He describes himself, on the other hand, as a climate realist and a guardian of the truth about global warming. But, as I said, he interprets the results, he only cites certain scientists, and he interprets the results of those who are recognized authorities as in such a way as to support his own views. And indeed, a number of people have defended themselves vigorously against the way he used their work. The book ends with chapters taking mainstream climate scientists and politicians to task for trying to change the world with their naively idealistic plans. And it ends with an alternative energy agenda which Fahrenholt claims combines an appropriate degree of climate protection in the longer term with economic prudence and a measure of fairness towards the developing countries, which he misses in his opponents. His message is one of reassurance: we don't need to do much. Die Sonne meint es gut mit uns. Sie gibt uns Zeit, die Dinge auf vernünftige Weise auf eine nachhaltige Basis zu stellen. So the sun is favorable towards us. It's giving us time by having a phase with not much solar flares and so on to get our house in order. Clean coal, gas, oil, nuclear, fracking all have a role to play, as well as offshore wind and solar energy. And who knows, maybe we'll have cracked nuclear fusion by the time the natural temperature cycle begins to rise again. That's a bit optimistic, but anyway. So Fahrenholt has direct links with the energy industry. At the time of writing, he was CEO of the green electricity company Innogy, a subsidiary of the giant RWE concern, which is one of Europe's 5 leading electricity and gas companies. Interests in oil, gas, lignite, electricity generation, etc. So, looking at his recipe for inaction on climate change, you could say, like Mandy Rice Davis, when Lord Astor denied having slept with her, well, he would, wouldn't he? But, on the other hand, Fahrenholt is an interesting character. He's a trained scientist. He's an honorary professor at the University of Hamburg, author of a highly critical book about the chemical industry back in 1978, Sowieso ist überall. He's not writing because he's in the pay of a company. He's convinced about what he's writing. It's not just a promotional pamphlet. Someone who engaged extensively with the science, although many people would say he's misunderstood a lot of it. So, very briefly, science in popular culture. The classic example of a climate skeptic novel is Michael Crichton's State of Fear. Michael Crichton made his name in science thrillers, you could say. The Andromeda Strain and Jurassic Park were picking up on anxieties in the general public about aspects of modern science and actually performing quite a useful function, educational function, in explaining well, to a certain extent, a useful educational function. He changed completely in this book, State of Fear, because he became obsessed with the idea that it's all a hoax and there's no such thing as climate change. This is a techno-thriller based on the idea that climate change is a hoax, circulated by politicians and scientists out of self-interest, and that natural disasters are either created or simulated by eco-terrorists so as to attract attention and funding. George Bush was an enthusiastic reader of State of Fear. The author was invited to spend an hour with the president in the Oval Office in 2005. And there is a suggestion, maybe, I don't know, that State of Fear helped to drive a political ideology that went against the facts. There are not actually many novels like this, but one I've been looking at recently is Sven Böttcher's book Prophezeiung, 2012, which combines elements of alarmism and skepticism in an unexpected way. This is an IPPP skeptical novel. It's a climate politics skeptical novel. Climate change is happening. This is set at about 20 years in the future. The conspiracy is one of seeking to derive financial and political advantage from its consequences. So I'm not going to say more about that because I do want to have my conclusion, tentative conclusions. At this point in my research, I can only really formulate hypotheses rather than any conclusions. I need to read more skeptical texts and to analyze them more systematically. However, the broad picture is obviously one of a relatively low level of skepticism in Germany, but of climate policy skepticism picking up especially since 2009. And this has been enough to trigger some concern over the possible influence of skeptics over political decision-making. The Greens, for instance, have questioned the government about it in the Bundestag. The Umweltbundesamt devotes a section of one of their publications to climate skepticism. Sorry, 16. And in Austria, this research project, Contra, has been funded to investigate the political impact of climate skepticism. Popular science seems to be the key medium, with a flood of publications, some from pretty respectable publishers. They're not all the cheap sort of Bahnhofshalle or whatever. And these publications have, some of them at least, like Fahrenholt and Lüning, given rise to articles in the press and extensive discussion on the web in blogs and magazines and chat forums. So climate skeptics, I think, come in all shapes and sizes. There's no single climate skeptic personality or identity, but they tend not to be, this is in Germany, primarily motivated by material interest or by political ideology. Nor indeed are they primarily motivated by disagreement over the science. It's been shown in a number of studies that skeptics in general tend to collect scientific arguments in support of a view they already hold, rather than searching for the truth. Tanja Fröhlich, who participated in meetings and events organized by the German climate skeptics as part of her research, gives an interesting insight into the sort of person they are. The skeptics she met were rarely in the pay of an energy company. They were frequently retired, living in quite comfortable circumstances. Didn't seem to be acting from a fear of loss of living standard through climate protection measures, nor were they primarily driven by affiliation with a particular ideology. They were often scientists by training. Sometimes she felt they were seeking compensation for a lack of recognition in their professional lives. Climate skepticism was part of a more general anti-establishment feeling in some cases. This suggests that skepticism might be linked with other marginal socio-political concerns and associated with sort of outsider mindsets. Fahrenholt is perhaps to a certain extent an outsider. He was the SPD Umweltsenator in Hamburg, and I understand he was responsible for commissioning some controversial waste incineration plants. He's been described as a party rebel. So someone who enjoys being not in the majority. In terms of regional distribution, it's possible that there's a concentration of climate skeptics in Thüringen and Sachsen. I'm just going by organizations and things on the web. Perhaps it has an additional resonance there, climate skepticism among groups disaffected with Western political structures, globalization, and open to a contrarian stance. A different kind of skeptic is the professional controversialist, media personalities and people like Dirk Maxeiner and Michael Mirsch, or indeed Matthias Horks, who have a way with words and seek to position themselves prominently in public debates. But they only get their significance by tapping into wider public anxieties. And to the extent that I can generalize at all from the construction of self and other, I think it's possible to say that skeptics understand themselves as resisting, as being sort of standing up against deprivation of individual freedom in the name of supposed common good by crypto-Marxists or eco-fascists. Many German skeptics believe anti-capitalists and opponents of globalization found a new home in environmental activism after the end of the student movement and the Cold War, and that they've continued their neo-Marxist work under the guise of environmentalism. Imposition of green morality, yes. The equation of climate skepticism with Holocaust denial. So environmentalists are described as a secular religion, a sort of heilige Mission, a quasi-universal moral norm which is being imposed. And finally, the flip side of German technological euphoria, the country's long-standing tradition of cultural pessimism. They're resisting that. Terms used, for instance, in an article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, wir müssen Urängste relativieren, and Untergangsterror. So you get terms used like Fortschrittsfeindlichkeit, Endzeithysterie, deutsche Angst, Naturromantik, Katastrophilie, Catastrophilia. Yeah. And that's it. Thank you.